Hello, everybody, and we are back following up on our last two video segments regarding monopolies and market power. Last video segment, we spent a little bit of time thinking about how to measure the degree of market power or the degree of market concentration in terms of thinking about where we were on that perfect competition to monopoly spectrum. And what we will do in this video segment is think about the issue of regulating monopolies. We're going to take a look very specifically at a special case known as a natural monopoly. So I want to start just by remembering the general problem that we're looking at when dealing with a monopoly situation, and that is the following. In the left-hand diagram, if the market were characterized as a perfectly competitive market, then we know that the marginal cost curve would be the supply curve, and the market equilibrium would be characterized by the price getting pressured towards P star, and this would support a volume of trade at Q star. In this allocation, the light blue triangle in the left diagram is the consumer surplus, the bottom green area is the producer surplus, and that is the largest that total surplus could possibly be. In the right diagram, if the market is monopolized by a single firm, the monopolist is going to produce to where the marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That defines the monopolist profit maximizing quantity, and then the monopolist goes up to the demand curve and charges the consumers their maximum willingness to pay at a price of PM. And note that this restricts the quantity of trade below Q star, causing our infamous deadweight loss, the shrinkage of the economic pie. So this was the main problem, that monopolies were inefficient. The monopolist tends to block mutually beneficial trades, and this is causing our typical deadweight loss from the volume of trade being too low relative to the efficient volume of trade. So the solution, more or less, if we were interested in fixing this problem from an efficiency perspective, is we're going to need to basically craft some sort of policy that is going to either incentivize or force this monopolist to increase the quantity of trade from QM towards that competitive level Q star. And there's a few ways that we can actually do this. So the policies that are aimed at fixing this type of problem take one of the following forms. We could find, for example, quantity restrictions, where we try to force the monopolist to produce at the competitive level of output Q star. We just regulate them. Hey, this is exactly what you have to produce. Problem is regulators need to know a whole lot about the monopolist technology and cost of production, and more than likely the regulators do not have this information. If anyone's in that position, it's the firm itself. So trying to use a command and control policy to control the monopoly output at Q star has its logistical issues. Price ceilings are another alternative to doing this. Again, a price ceiling, we could think about forcing the monopolist to charge the competitive price at marginal cost, and this would then induce the output level at Q star, alleviating the deadweight loss problem. Another policy we know that would incentivize a monopolist to actually produce more is to subsidize their production. This would shift the marginal cost curve of the monopolist down and would wind up pushing the monopoly quantity towards the competitive level. Taxation might be a tempting policy to consider here when thinking about regulating or quote unquote punishing a monopolist, but remember what the consequence of taxation was. That it reduced the quantity of trade, that it disincentivized trade even more, not that it increased the volume of trade. So the taxing of the monopolist in this situation is exactly the opposite of what we really want to do to achieve the goal of increasing output towards the competitive level. Another opportunity for government intervention would be government takeover. So perhaps the government, for example, absorbs the company's operation. We wind up with a post office or a DMV type scenario where the government entity then decides to make it its objective to produce the competitive quantity at marginal cost pricing. Another policy that we've seen in the past is just breaking up the monopoly, trying to dismantle them into smaller competitive entities, the idea being that the competitive entities would then support a competitive volume of trade in that market. Now, we're going to focus on a very special case of a monopoly known as a natural monopoly. And what a natural monopoly basically is a combination of two things. It's a combination of our monopoly model, and then we're going to introduce an element of technological complexity to the model, and that is we're going to introduce economies of scale in production. Okay, so we're going to basically be dealing with a monopolist that's facing a downward sloping average cost curve. And we discussed earlier this idea that the larger the fixed cost is relative to the variable cost, the larger a range of output levels existed in which the monopolist faced economies of scale, that minimum efficient scale of production where the average cost curve reaches its minimum. That was really, really big when high fixed costs were also in play. Okay, so the case of a natural monopoly, this is often associated with industries where you have really high fixed costs, like telecoms, air travel, anywhere where you have really high fixed infrastructure or fixed investment or fixed R&D costs before you can even produce or sell any units of output. So in this special type of situation here, the average cost curve will be sloping downwards when we face economies of scale by definition. And the other thing to remember is that when the average is decreasing, that's because the marginal is underneath. So the marginal cost curve will be below the average cost curve in this situation as well. Okay. So here are just a look at the two different situations. We're really looking at monopoly on the left here versus natural monopoly on the right diagram. Okay, so notice the demand curve and marginal revenue curves, they're both downward sloping. That's not the difference between these two situations. What's different is the shape of the average cost curve. We've introduced a different technology in the right diagram, a technology that is consistent with being very heavy on the fixed costs relative to variable cost dominance of the cost structure. Okay, now, there's an important trade-off that we face when we try to regulate a natural monopolist that is not there, that's really absent compared to when thinking about regulating a monopolist that does not face economies of scale in production. So I want to take a minute and kind of illustrate this complexity of this problem that we're facing with this trade-off. And the trade-off is the following. If we were to force the natural monopolist on the right diagram to produce Q star to rectify the trade volume problem and restore the economic pie to its maximized size, what winds up happening, as we're going to see here, is we face a problem where the monopolist winds up eating a loss that it otherwise wouldn't have faced if it didn't live in this economies of scale environment. Okay, so if we do force the monopolist to produce this output level Q star, then we go up to the demand curve, and that supports a price of P star. So that's like our competitive equilibrium in this market if the marginal cost curve, again, was the supply curve. And notice at a quantity produced of Q star, if we go up to the average cost curve, which is above the marginal cost curve, we see the average cost is well above the price. And the difference between those two values is the loss per unit. If we multiply that by the number of units that we are selling here at Q star, then that entire pink region is the entire value of the profit loss to the monopolist at this output level of Q star. Okay, now, so this is kind of the trade-off here, is that if we want to fix the economic pie problem, if we want to fix the efficiency problem, this is going to necessitate that this natural monopolist lose money. It's going to operate at a profit loss. Okay, now, note that at Q star, when we look at the consumer and the producer surplus, again, the producer surplus is different than profit, right? Profit subtracts out the fixed cost where producer surplus does not. A producer surplus is total revenue minus total variable cost, whereas profit is total revenue minus total cost. Okay, so if we're looking at just the sum of consumer and producer surplus, we see now that when we force the monopolist to produce Q star, there is no deadweight loss. Okay, so this is the trade-off. We can get rid of the deadweight loss, but in doing so, the monopolist is going to be forced to operate at a profit loss, and that may not be sustainable. Okay, so here's the trade-off. Monopolist operates at a profit loss, but now the economic pie is back to its full size. Okay, so this was that trade-off, profit loss versus full efficiency. Now, this trade-off doesn't really exist with a regular monopoly. And just to show you this, if we were to set a price ceiling at P star in this diagram, then again, that's going to induce the quantity of trade at Q star. And note that since we're not facing economies of scale at Q star, we're at a portion of the average cost function where the marginal cost is above it, meaning the average cost is getting pulled up. The difference between the price and the average cost is positive, and that lime green area there, it's not, again, not producer surplus, but that is the profit, the total profit that the monopolist is making at the allocation Q star P star. So it is absolutely possible here that in the absence of economies of scale, that forcing the monopolist to produce at the competitive allocation by either putting a price floor at P star or forcing them or subsidizing them until they produce Q star, that works in a way that doesn't force the monopolist to absorb a loss. Now, back to the issue of the natural monopolist. If they do have high fixed cost structure and they do face these scale economies, okay, well, then we kind of faced a problem here. When we set the price ceiling at marginal cost, right, we can induce the efficient outcome for the natural monopolist, but it was impossible for that monopolist to make a positive profit. And in that sense, this solution is unsustainable in the long term. It either requires the government to take over the entity, run it as such, and absorb that loss, which requires taxpayer funding, okay? Or the government can subsidize the entity and allow it to operate privately. The government will subsidize the loss, and again, that requires taxpayer funding. So either way, there's some sort of external funding required to deal with the loss subsidization or the coverage of that loss if you want that entity to keep functioning. One alternative to this kind of like harsh type of regulation, right, all the way down to marginal cost, is to say, well, instead of regulating the firm at marginal cost, what if we just let the monopolist break even? Okay, why not just let it set a price ceiling at average cost instead of at marginal cost? Okay, the one upside of this is that the firm doesn't make a loss and hence doesn't really require any sort of government subsidy or government takeover. Okay, the negative that we're going to see here, first off, is that we're not going to completely eliminate the deadweight loss, so the outcome is still inefficient. We're going to partially rectify it, but we're not going to be able to completely fix it. Another big negative, and it's not a bullet point I have on the slide here, but it's important nevertheless, is that if you regulate a firm by forcing it to price at average cost, and that means it's going to break even no matter what it does. Okay, and what I mean by that is if I had an opportunity to invest in some new technology that would lower my cost, okay, well, if my cost is lowered and my average cost is reduced as a consequence, and I'm being regulated in this fashion, then what's going to happen? Well, the regulator is just going to tell me, hey, well, you have to now lower your price down to that new cost that you just got from your investment. So the idea is, if I'm going to make zero profit anyway, whether or not my cost is low or my cost is high, regulating a monopolist in a way where they are always breaking even because you're forcing them to price at average cost really disincentivizes any sort of investment in future cost reducing technologies. And again, that could be inefficient from a dynamic perspective. So again, that's another really big negative, is that this type of regulation really disincentivizes the incentive to minimize costs in the long run through technological innovation and investment. Now, I want to just take a minute and compare diagrammatically, again, the base case where we had a natural monopolist that we were not regulating, to the case where we have a natural monopolist that we are now regulating by forcing them to charge a price at average cost instead of marginal cost. So first case on the left here, if the monopolist is unregulated, then he produces where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and he charges that markup above marginal cost, resulting in this gigantic deadweight loss. Now, if we compare this to the monopolist, if we force the monopolist to price at average cost, okay, well, let's think about how that works. If we find the quantity where the average cost curve and the demand curve cross each other, that's the quantity where the average cost and the price would be equal, meaning that is the quantity where we would be breaking even if we were pricing at that particular level. Okay, note that the deadweight loss triangle on the right diagram is much smaller than it is in the left-hand diagram. So in the pursuit of trying to fix the inefficiency problem, we've at least improved the outcome. The economic pie is bigger. However, we haven't fixed it entirely. Okay, so what we've done here is we've kind of softened up on that trade-off that we saw when we forced the monopolist to produce a Q star with things like marginal cost pricing. Okay, there was this trade-off between, if we regulated too harshly, then the monopolist couldn't make a profit, but we could restore the economic pie potentially. In this situation now, we allow the monopolist to break even, so we kind of softened up. We allowed them to bring the price up to the average cost. They break even, but now we can't get rid of the deadweight loss entirely. So there's a bit of a trade-off here between dealing with the monopolist profit loss in the regulatory side versus mitigating the deadweight loss completely on the market efficiency side. Okay, next thing I want to do is just compare the average cost and the marginal cost pricing. So again, this diagram that we're looking at here on the left, no regulation at all. On the right, we're comparing to average cost pricing. Now we're going to look again at the base case of marginal cost pricing. This is when we force the monopolist to charge a price at marginal cost, and this induced a profit loss at a quantity of Q star. Again, the left-hand diagram that resulted in zero deadweight loss, just profit loss. Okay, the right side diagram, okay, us pricing an average cost. This results in a deadweight loss, that pink triangle, but there is no profit loss, meaning there is no external source of funds required by the government or taxpayer subsidization to keep the monopolist functioning in the right-hand outcome. Okay, so this is a trade-off that policymakers have to think about if the intention is to use a price floor to regulate a monopolist, especially if there are the presence of high fixed costs leading to economies of scale. If we regulate by forcing the monopolist to price at marginal cost, this induces a profit loss. So there's maybe some subsidy or some taxpayer funds or some sort of external funding required to cover that profit loss. Or we can allow the firm to break even, force them to price at average cost, and not entirely fix the problem. So there's kind of a weighting going on here between how big is the deadweight loss that we're trying to fix versus how much of a profit loss does that create for the firm. Okay, So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some details with antitrust legislation. This is specifically the rules sort of outlining the major regulatory constraints on monopolies and concentrations of market power. And there are sort of four major landmark legislation that we're going to talk about here. First is the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Then came the Clayton and FTC Acts in 1914. And last but not least was the Robinson-Patman Act that we're going to discuss just briefly here, which was actually an amendment to the Clayton Act, which came later in 1936. The Sherman Act has two key sections that we are going to discuss very briefly here. The first section, the language is as such: every contract combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy and restraint of trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations is hereby declared illegal. So any sort of conspiracy to restrain trade, the Sherman Act makes that illegal. What Section 2 does is it not only makes monopolizing illegal, but it makes it a felony. Every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize or combine or conspire with any other person or persons to monopolize any part of the trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations shall be deemed guilty of a felony. Okay, so the Sherman Act, this is pretty serious for its time. Okay, the Clayton Act, Section 2, basically prohibits some forms of price discrimination. The Robinson-Patman Act came a little bit later, and what that did is it prevented essentially suppliers from giving large retailers a better quantity discount than mom and pop retailers on large orders. So it prohibited some forms of what is known as second degree price discrimination or volume discounts, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in the next video segment. Section 3 prohibits sales based on the condition that buyers not buy from a competitor where the effect may be to substantially lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly in any line of commerce. And Section 7 provides oversight for some mergers and acquisitions here, and it prohibits mergers where the effect of such acquisition would be substantially to lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly in any line of commerce. So this is Section 7 is kind of where our analysis of structural metrics like the HHI would come into play. The FTC Act of 1914 established the Federal Trade Commission, and Section 5 is important here. It targets specifically unfair methods of competition in or affecting commerce, and unfair or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce are declared unlawful. Okay, so these are kind of the key landmark legislations that provide the regulatory basis for government intervention in monopoly outcomes, more or less. I wanted to just go over a couple historical examples of the government utilizing the final strategy of just breaking up a firm into smaller entities. A couple infamous breakups historically. One of the more recent ones was the Ma Bell breakup here of AT&T and Bell Systems. So this diagram, there's a lot going on here, but you can more or less see how the original entity was broken up first into what were called the baby bells, and these entities have evolved over time and have been spun off many, many times over. So you can sort of see how that looks here. I'm going to show you one more diagram that puts more of this in a timeline context. And I think what's interesting to note here in this situation is that if you look at where Ma Bell was broken up back in, well, really 82 was when they were broken up, and 84 is when all these companies were spun off. But if you look carefully at this flow diagram, it shows not only how the companies were separated over time, but over time, how the entities were actually reacquired. And currently, the current entity that is AT&T again has more or less reacquired all the parts that it was forced to divest from in 1982 through 1984. And it's really bigger than ever in terms of not only consumer base, but market capitalization as well. So it's interesting that the antitrust division isn't really going after them now. And one reason why is the nature of the telecoms industry has changed dramatically since they were a threat to anti-competition back in 1984, when all we really had were landlines and you had a monopoly over long distance. So this is something interesting, I think, to look at. Another very famous situation where the government came in and broke up a large monopoly was back when John Rockefeller's Standard Oil was broken up. And this was actually broken up in a Supreme Court ruling in 1919. And again, you can see here a nice timeline of how the breakup and the subsequent competitors that resulted have evolved into what we see today: Chevron, ExxonMobil, BP, etc. So monopolies, kind of an interesting thing to think about. I wanted to leave you with one idea here, and that idea is there's a strange legal dichotomy underpinning how government treats monopolies. One flip side of the coin is we have antitrust laws, which exhibit government concern for things like unfair or deceptive business practices, leveling the playing field in the situation where they're restricting certain forms of price discrimination. It also regulates mergers and acquisitions and explicitly makes conspiracy to monopolize not only criminal, but a felony. Not only a crime, but it is explicitly a felony. And these laws here are really concerned about, the short-term inefficiency and really some equity redistribution from consumers here that are resulting from the concentration of market power. Now, what's interesting to think about is that we have these laws, but we also have, on the flip side again of the same coin, intellectual property laws, which are literally government licenses to exercise monopoly power. Okay. For example, we have patents, which protect ideas. The duration of patents, depending on the type of patent, utility versus design, can range between about 15 to 20 years. So you have that long to essentially extract monopoly profits before the idea goes into the public domain and then anybody can use it. Copyrights, which protect expression, have even longer durations of protection, I think on order of 70 to 120 years, depending on things like when the author of the work passes away. Trademarks protect your branding and commerce. If you're trading something, you have to brand it a particular way to protect other people from stealing your branding. So all of these, again, are really the government allowing you to consolidate market power here to extract some short-term profits. And, how can these two laws exist together? Well, one is negotiating a short-term efficiency trade-off, right? Antitrust laws are kind of worried about this short-term efficiency loss, but intellectual property laws are aimed at incentivizing long-term efficiency. If I can't extract profits, there's no incentive for me to do any innovation. So there is a weird necessity of monopolies in some respect that if people aren't going to be rewarded for their good ideas with the opportunity to extract excess profits, then those good ideas are going to go away. So this was an interesting thought, I think, to leave you with here, is that we have this strange legal dichotomy, these two types of laws, one saying that monopolies are bad and we shouldn't have them, and the other one essentially offering a government license to run monopolies. So that's it for this particular video segment. We're going to pick up again with a discussion of price discrimination shortly. Hope you enjoy. See you soon.